Hi, thanks, Jeremy. I hope you can hear me and see the slides. And I'm just saying hello to everyone on the video, but I'm going to switch that off shortly. And I'm going to proceed. So thanks again for the invitation to speak on malaria and give an update. And good afternoon, everyone. So each year, World Malaria Day is commemorated in April. And this year it was commemorated on the 25th of April, with the theme being accelerating the fight against malaria for a more equitable world. However, you'll see from communications at this time of the year, especially this week, which has been set aside as SADC Malaria Week between the 4th to the 8th of November, you may be thinking, so what is this, given that World Malaria Day occurs in April? So SADC Malaria Week is observed annually at this time of the year, and SADC Malaria Day is observed on Wednesday, the 6th of November, and this occurs in the 14 malaria endemic countries within the Southern African Development Community, or SADC. But unlike World Malaria Day, which falls on the 25th of April, during the region's low malaria season, SADC Malaria Day coincides with the period of increased malaria transmission in Southern Africa. So the beginning of our summer generally marks the start of the malaria season in South Africa, and this is due to the higher temperatures and increased rainfall in the malaria transmission areas. So why have a SADC Malaria Week? It aims to improve malaria awareness and increase the participation of the malaria-affected communities to try and effectively control malaria throughout the SADC region. The week is dedicated to creating awareness and educating the public about malaria and other health-related issues, such as HIV, AIDS, and TB in the region. So malaria is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the SADC region, causing an estimated 50,000 deaths annually. But despite the momentum gained towards malaria elimination in the region, integrated community involvement and collaboration has never been more urgent because of emerging new threats to malaria control. So given all of this, it's indeed an opportune time for me to talk to you about malaria, to recap some of the epidemiology, highlight some of these important emerging issues, and the implications they are for clinical and laboratory practice. So let's start with some important facts about malaria. Here are the latest global malaria statistics as reported by the World Health Organization. This comes from the 2023 World Malaria Report, which reports on data for 2022. So malaria is endemic throughout most of the tropics, with 50% of the world's population, that's about 4 billion people, at risk across 85 endemic countries. The WHO reported 249 million malaria cases in 2022, with 608,000 estimated deaths. So, of course, of note, the African region shoulders the heaviest malaria burden, with an estimated 233 million cases and 580,000 deaths in 2022. So that's 94% of all cases and 95% of all deaths. On the continent, there are 4 countries: Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Mozambique, our neighbors, which accounted for nearly half of all malaria cases globally. But the real devastating reality is that from these deaths, 76% occur in children under the age of 5. So this translates into a daily toll of over 1,000 deaths in this age group. And what this really means in real terms is that nearly every minute on the African continent, a child under the age of 5 dies of malaria, and many of these deaths are preventable and treatable. So what's been happening globally in terms of efforts with malaria control? If you look at this graph, 2 graphs, the global trends in malaria case incidence in blue and the mortality rate below in red, you can appreciate that gains have been made over the past 2 decades. But the last few years, and specifically the 4-year period from 2019 to 2022, There have been large disruptions to malaria services during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this drove up malaria incidence and mortality rates at a time when progress against the disease had already stalled. So malaria endemic countries have since managed to stabilize these rates, but at a high level. And if you look at it in terms of both malaria cases and deaths, the world is actually worse off now than it was before the pandemic in terms of malaria. If you look at the number of people residing in malaria risk areas as per these end malaria dashboards, currently half the world's population, as you can see, live in malaria risk areas. And this number is increasing year on year, as seen in the graph on the right. The map highlights the areas between the tropics where malaria transmission occurs and the corresponding number of people at risk per country. Here are the estimated incidence of malaria by country for the year 2022. And clearly you can see that sub-Saharan Africa carries the heaviest burden. The graph to the right tracks the cases seen versus the global targets. So you can see from 2015 to 2022, the targets have been decreasing, but the actual cases have been on the increase. And so there's this expanding gap between where we are and where we are aiming to be, and this is growing. So just to mention that in terms of the parasites, Plasmodium falciparum causes the largest burden of disease globally, followed by P. vivax. P. falciparum predominates in sub-Saharan Africa and on the Indian subcontinent, in Eastern Asia and Oceania. And P. vivax is much more common in the Americas and the Western Pacific. P. malaria is uncommon. It is found in most endemic areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And P. ovale is less common, is unusual outside of Africa, and usually comprises less than 1% of isolates. And we'll talk a little bit more about zoonotic malaria later on in the talk. So we looked at the number of malaria cases globally, but if we just look at the number of cases for the years between 2019 to 2022, and you see between 2021 and 2022, there was actually an increase in cases, with 5 million more in 2022. And of these 5 countries, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Uganda, and Papua New Guinea bore the brunt of these increases. And these countries had multiple challenges that hindered malaria control. But just take note of Pakistan. Pakistan accounted for almost 50% of this increase. So it begs the question, what was happening in this country in 2022 to account for this upsurge in numbers? And just keep that in mind because I will expand on this a bit later. Looking at the number of deaths more in detail, and you can see again the swathe of red across Africa on this heat map, which depicts the highest numbers of deaths. And of note, deaths increased during COVID, as you can see on the graph on the right in 2020, and stabilized in the years thereafter, but remained higher than numbers prior to the pandemic. Again, the targets versus the actual numbers of deaths is an ever-increasing gap. So given all of this, what are the malaria control goals? What can we aim for? So malaria eradication, that is global elimination of human disease, is still the global vision of the World Health Organization. It is an ambitious goal, but if it's attained, it will save millions of lives. But successful eradication efforts requires tools that are not currently available. So hence this speaks to the theme for the World Malaria Day, the critical importance of an accelerated research and development agenda. So, however, malaria control, as per these definitions, control and elimination, are more attainable, with elimination being the reduction of incidence and transmission to zero in humans in a defined geographic area, and control being a reduction of disease incidence and prevalence to levels that do not pose a threat to public health or that are acceptable to a community. In all of these instances, a surveillance system that can detect, respond to, and report malaria cases and infections promptly is essential. And here you see this diagram of the epidemiological milestones that we mentioned that occur at regional and national level before we can move on to attaining at a global level malaria eradication. So there's been some recent good news, and as evidenced by several countries which have successfully been certified malaria-free, most recently Egypt. So malaria in Egypt can be traced back to around 4000 BC, and there's DNA evidence that shows that even Tutankhamun, the Egyptian boy pharaoh, had multiple malaria infections during his life. There have been numerous other mummified bodies that have also tested positive for malaria. So a disease that plagued pharaohs has finally been eliminated. And efforts to control malaria in Egypt started about 100 years ago in the 1920s, and this year became the 4th African country to eradicate malaria. And the WHO has said this is a significant public health milestone that took almost 100 years to achieve. And it is indeed a testament that Africa can do better in dealing with the disease. And Egypt joins Algeria, Cabo Verde, and Mauritius on the continent to add to a group of 44 malaria-free nations globally. So what is happening with South Africa? In terms of our context, in recent years, there have been significant progress in efforts to eliminate malaria. The WHO lists South Africa as one of the countries that has the potential to eliminate the disease in the near future, and even hailed South Africa in 2021 for bucking the grim trend of, despite COVID challenges, seeing case reductions during that time period. But it's not all good news, because for the second time in a decade, South Africa has missed its malaria elimination target. Initially, the country had committed to ending malaria by 2018 and then by 2023, and obviously this has not happened. But the Department of Health remains committed towards elimination. And there are numerous and complex reasons for South Africa missing the target, and COVID was one of them. Many of the resources were diverted to deal with the pandemic. So the new goal is to aim for elimination by 2028. And in this press release from the National Department of Health, which was issued on World Malaria Day, South Africa is committed to a national strategic plan towards elimination. Importantly, the bottom arrow points out that there have been gains made. There's been sub-national elimination of malaria in the King Cetshwayo district in KZN, and more gains being made in the other malaria endemic provinces. So local malaria transmission occurs in South Africa mainly in the low altitude areas of the Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and KZN provinces, especially in the areas bordering Zimbabwe and Mozambique, as you can see on the right in the malaria risk map. And malaria transmission mostly occurs in the rainy season between September and May, with Plasmodium falciparum accounting for the majority of malaria cases, and is the predominant species associated with severe and fatal illness. In Limpopo province, Vhembe and Mopani districts experience the highest burden of disease. In Mpumalanga, transmission is highest in the Bushbuck Ridge and in Komazi municipalities. And of all of the 3 endemic provinces, KZN reports the lowest burden of malaria cases. And if you look at the number of people residing and at risk, overall, there are approximately 6 million people living in these areas who are at risk for malaria in South Africa. So malaria is, just as a reminder, malaria is a Category 1 notifiable medical condition. It requires healthcare practitioners to report cases within 24 hours of diagnosing a case, and the case definitions as you see here and available on the NICD website. So case definitions, notifying malaria is important because it enables disease tracking in endemic provinces, and it also allows investigation of cases that occur in non-endemic areas. And surveillance is really key. So clinical, epidemiological, entomological, and parasitological surveillance of malaria is really key and required to follow the progress of malaria control and the move towards elimination. And it also informs information like this, where we see a graph showing the overview of the malaria seasonal trends between 2008 and up to April 2024. So if you look at the number of cases over the years, you can see quite easily that malaria case numbers and deaths rose significantly in 2017. This was following heavy rainfall and other logistic operational challenges at the time. But because cases were being tracked, interventions were quickly implemented with the resulting impact in reduction in cases and deaths. In 2020 and 2021, we see lower numbers as a result of reduced cross-border movements because of the COVID lockdown regulations, coupled with proactive actions by the provincial malaria control programs. But more recently, you see that the country's malaria cases have started to rise, and this was following the lifting of the travel restrictions. Plasmodium falciparum still accounts for majority of the cases. And important to note that although non-endemic, there's a significant number of imported cases that are seen each year in Gauteng province. This is because Gauteng is our major travel and economic hub. So eliminating malaria is an ambitious task. It requires sustainable resources and, importantly, collaboration with neighboring countries. And I think just important to mention here now that the provincial name for the malaria control programs has actually now moved to the malaria elimination programs as we all move towards elimination. If you want to look at the trends in more detail, there's been a recent publication in the Public Health Bulletin reviewing the trends in South Africa for the 2022 to 2023 malaria season based on the notifiable medical condition surveillance system. By Maxwell Maboda et al. So just before we move on, a word about Odyssean malaria. Now, Odyssean malaria is not the same as imported malaria, but is also synonymously known as minibus, taxi, or airport or suitcase malaria. And it refers to malaria transmitted by an infected mosquito, which is translocated. So that is, the patient has no travel history to a malarious area. And there's also, you've excluded the other more uncommon routes of transmission, such as blood transfusion, injection or needle stick injury, or congenital. These have all been excluded. So you can see here on this table, the NICD has been involved in many outbreak investigations of Odyssean malaria cases over the years. So in total, 166 between 1996 to date. And as these cases are rare and sporadic, the diagnosis is unexpected and so is often missed or diagnosis is delayed, resulting in a high case fatality rate of 15%. And this is approximately 10 times higher than the national fatality rate for malaria. So it's really important for clinicians and all healthcare workers to bear in mind, especially in a patient with unexplained fever, with low platelets, even in the absence of travel history, even in a malaria non-endemic province. So recently, we've also looked at all of the Odyssean malaria case investigations that the NICD was involved with between 2014 and 2023. And you can read further also in the Public Health Bulletin recently published. But just to see of note what the geographical distribution of the cases in this time period, as seen here on the heat map. But if you, on the left-hand side, then put in all of the national routes, the road routes throughout the country, you can throughout the province, you can easily see that a lot of these cases cluster around the major national routes and highways. So this is predominantly how these infective mosquitoes travel and infect people in other areas. So just a brief reminder about the protozoal pathogen that we're talking about. So we talked about where they occur, but predominantly P. falciparum causes the largest burden of disease, followed by P. vivax. We talked about the others, but just to also talk about P. knowlesi, which is morphologically similar to P. malariae, It is a significant issue within areas of Southeast Asia, identified by molecular methods, predominantly occurring in Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar. There are some other zoonotic malaria species like simium. It's a malaria species closely resembling P. vivax, occurring in primates predominantly, but there have been a few isolated cases in humans in Brazil. So just to put in the life cycle to remind all of us about the vector and the parasite and the life cycle. So the malaria parasite is transmitted by the bite of a female Anopheles species mosquito, which occurs mainly between dusk and dawn. Only the female mosquitoes bite humans or animals to obtain protein needed for producing eggs. The most effective mosquito vector of malaria are those such as the Anopheles gambiae, which are found in Africa. These mosquitoes are long-lived. They occur in high densities in tropical climates. They breed readily. They rest and bite mostly within dwellings, and they bite humans in preference to other animals. So if you look at the malaria parasite life cycle, it involves the two hosts, the mosquito and the human. During a blood meal, the malaria-infected female mosquito inoculates the sporozoites into the human host. These then enter the circulation and infect liver cells, and they mature into tissue schizons. Then replication occurs, producing tens of thousands of merozoites. And when these tissue schizons rupture, they release the merozoites, which invade the bloodstream. So, of course, of note, in the relapsing species, P. vivax and ovale, there's a dormant stage or hypnozoite stage, which can persist in the liver and cause relapses by invading the bloodstream weeks or even years later. So once in the bloodstream, the merozoites attach, they penetrate the erythrocytes, and they undergo asexual multiplication. And basically, this is continues, and with the rupture, this blood stage is responsible for the clinical manifestations of the disease. It's also where diagnostics occur. And then some parasites differentiate into the sexual gametocytes. These then are ingested by a mosquito during a blood meal. In the mosquito's stomach, these microgametes penetrate the macrogametes and generate the zygotes. These become motile, they invade the midgut of the mosquito and then develop into oocysts. The oocysts then rupture, they release the sporozoites. These make their way to the mosquito's salivary glands. Inoculation of the sporozoites into a new human host perpetuates the malaria life cycle. So just keeping that life cycle in mind, in terms of prophylaxis and treatment, here we have a diagram that shows where these actually work. So drugs that prevent Plasmodium species invasion or proliferation in the liver have prophylactic activity. Drugs that act on the red blood cell stages are required for treatment of the symptomatic phase of the disease. And compounds that inhibit the formation of gametocytes or their development in the mosquito are transmission blocking agents. And then just to bear in mind, when we talk about malaria vaccines, they also act on the pre-erythrocytic stage of the life cycle. So seeing that we've recapped the epidemiology and the biology of the parasite, what is the current situation in terms of malaria control? So in recent years, there have been some worrying emerging potential threats to gains made in malaria control. The WHO has declared climate change the single biggest health threat facing humanity. And in line with this, the latest 2023 World Malaria Report includes, for the first time ever, a dedicated chapter focused on the intersection between climate change and malaria. Now, this is because malaria is a particularly climate-sensitive disease, and climate change and interaction with malaria transmission is complex, and evidence to support reliable predictions is actually difficult, challenging, and sparse. But changing climate can have both direct and indirect effects on malaria transmission and burden. So climate change can directly affect malaria transmission due to the sensitivity of the malaria parasite and the mosquito to temperature, rainfall, and humidity. So for example, ideal mosquito breeding and survival occurs at temperatures ranging from between 20 to 27 degrees Celsius. So a slight warming in cooler malaria-free zones could actually lead to new malaria cases. Indirect effects, there are quite a few, and these can occur through things like reduced access to essential health services, disruptions to infrastructure and supply chain of critical malaria commodities, such as insecticide-treated nets and medicines, population displacement. So you may get people who have no immunity to malaria now moving into malaria endemic areas, and rising food insecurity and malnutrition. This is risk factors for severe malaria amongst young children and pregnant women. So the strongest evidence to date for climate change impact on malaria comes from the following two examples. On the left-hand side, you see a map, and this comes from a publication from a long time series data from the African highland areas that are on the fringes of endemic transmission areas. So in areas like Kenya, Uganda, the Central African Republic, and Ethiopia. So tracking data over years suggests that over recent decades, rising temperatures due to climate change have led to the expansion of malaria into these highland areas. The second example is that of Pakistan. So we said we were going to come back to what was happening in Pakistan in 2022. So in that year, extreme weather in Pakistan saw glaciers melt and subsequently surging of rivers in the north of the country. And in the south of the country, there was heating of the Indian Ocean, which led to excessive rainfall and flooding. And so post-flood standing water became ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and malaria cases increased 5-fold compared to the previous year. So in 2021, there are about 500,000 cases reported, and in 2022, they reported 2.6 million cases, predominantly, as you see in the graph below, in the provinces of Sindh and Balochistan. So the reason for this is that the floods destroyed infrastructure, isolated millions of people, as you can see in the picture on the top, hindering medical access and increasing disease risk and malaria transmission. So in addition to extreme weather events, various other forces have also led to both epidemics and significant spikes in malaria cases and deaths. These drivers include conflict, humanitarian crises, migration and population displacement, and also decreased funding and socioeconomic constraints. But for this talk, I want to focus on emerging biological threats in addition to climate change. Now, these threats can be attributed to parasite or vector factors. On the top, the parasite-related threats include drug resistance and evasion of diagnostic detection. And at the bottom, vector-related threats include insecticide resistance and invasive vector species. So in terms of anti-malarial drug efficacy and resistance, we are reliant on artemisinin, which are established anti-malarial agents with excellent safety profile. And in fact, since 2006, artemisinin-based combination therapies, or ACTs, were recommended by the World Health Organization as first-line treatment of uncomplicated falciparum malaria in all areas in which malaria is endemic. And since then, there has shown to be reduced morbidity and mortality associated with malaria because of the efficacy of these treatments. Parenteral artesunate was also recommended as first-line treatment for both pediatric and adult severe malaria in 2010. This was following large clinical trials which showed the significantly reduced mortality in patients receiving this treatment compared to those receiving quinine. So this is demonstrated in this graph, which I've shown before from NEJM 2011, but it really does highlight the activity of artemisinins. So on this graph at the bottom in blue, you can see again sensitive P. falciparum infection, the fast-acting and rapidly cleared artemisinins, which are the most potent antimalarial drugs known. They can actually lead to a 10,000-fold reduction per 48-hour asexual stage of the parasite cycle. So that's if you have a sensitive parasite. But in red, the partially resistant strains of P. falciparum, you can see that the parasite load is now reduced only by a factor of 100 per cycle, And this is an effect similar to that of the slower acting drugs, older drugs such as quinine. If you look to the top, another unique and advantage feature of the artemisinin is a broad stage specificity. So if you look at the top in blue, artemisinins acting against sensitive parasites act on ring, trophozoite, and schizon stages. But this seems to be compromised in the resistant parasites. So parasites that are at the ring stage show reduced susceptibility, which results in delayed parasite clearance following treatment. So this delayed clearance is worrying because it could be a step towards high-level resistance and frank treatment failure. And while the artemisinins have very short half-lives, this loss of potency also renders the more slowly eliminating drugs that are part of the combination therapies also vulnerable to development of resistance. So as you can see here in the figure that's just come up, the evolution of the parasite biomass in the body following the combination administration. So in pink, you see the artemisinin acts rapidly by reducing the parasite biomass, but in the peach color, the partner drug eliminates the remaining parasites. So why is this emergence of ACT or artemisinin resistance such a threat? Well, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, all of these countries that are shaded in the different colors use different combinations of artemisinin and other drugs. But all of them are using an ACT as first-line treatment. More than 80% of the countries use artemether-lumefantrine combination, including in South Africa. So if we are losing efficacy to artemisinin, we really have a very significant emerging threat on the continent if these drugs start failing, because there are no current effective alternative regimens. So how is this resistance detected and monitored? It can be assessed using several tools. For some of the drugs, genetic changes are associated with reduced drug sensitivity, and these have been identified. So there's an established list of validated and candidate PF-Calch13 markers associated with delayed clearance after a treatment containing artemisinin. And these mutations have emerged on the continent in Eritrea, Rwanda, and Uganda, and they are spreading. Treatment failure rates still remain below 10% because the partner drug is still effective. And there are ongoing studies to determine the extent of these mutations and to do further investigations in terms of parasite clearance time and in vitro resistance. So WHO has published these malaria threat maps. And here you see the one for delayed parasite clearance for P. falciparum from 2010 to 2024 against artemether-lumefantrine. And you can clearly appreciate that although these mutations were first detected in Southeast Asia, there seems to have been de novo resistance mutations occurring on the African continent. And the pace of resistance has quickened, and the achievements made in the past decades in the fight against malaria, especially on the continent, is now under a threat of being reversed. For WHO, a key area of concern is the emergence of artemisinin partial resistance in Africa. Such resistance is spreading in countries in Eastern Africa, as you can see on the map, and the Horn of Africa especially. Currently, nearly all patients, though, infected with these parasites, if they are treated with an ACT, they are fully cured, provided the partner drug is efficacious. But in 2022, WHO also published guidance and strategies to respond to this burgeoning threat on the continent. In terms of South Africa, resistance testing and surveillance is performed at the NICD. It's performed by the ARMA, or the Anti-Malarial Resistance Monitoring and Malaria Operational Lab, run by Dr. Jayshree Raman here at the NICD. And currently, there have been no validated or candidate molecular markers of artemisinin resistance present. South Africa was one of the first African countries to establish such a program. Unfortunately, according to Jayshree, currently the program is still underutilized by the provincial malaria elimination programs, which have to send her samples to be tested. Samples from the provinces most affected by malaria, especially from Limpopo, are really being sent for this program, and there's been a lot of effort made to try and improve this. But she has shared the surveillance data, and currently there have been no validated CALCH markers detected in any samples that have been tested to date. However, there have been other mutations that have been detected. What these actually mean has not yet been elucidated, but what it does point to is that there's increasing pressure, drug pressure in our local context. There's no validated markers for the partner drug lumefantrine resistance that can be tested for, but to date, it hasn't been detected in South Africa. So for you, the clinician, when should we be thinking about artemisinin and delayed clearance or resistance? And this usually is the case if you have a patient that has repeated malaria episodes. Now, recurrent malaria is quite a perplexing clinical problem, and we've had a few cases that we've been involved in. But I thought it would be a good time to kind of go through the definitions that fall under recurrence. So recurrence in general means symptoms of malaria which recur after varying symptom-free periods. And depending on the cause, recurrence, which is this blanket term, can be classified as either recrudescence, relapse, or reinfection. So recrudescence is when symptoms return after a symptom-free period. It's caused by parasites surviving in the blood as a result of inadequate or ineffective treatment. It's generally due to P. falciparum or P. malariae, but can apply to all species and generally occurs after 2 to 4 weeks. When we talk about relapse, the recurrence of disease after it has been apparently cured, in malaria, true relapses are caused by reactivation of the dormant liver stage parasites or hypnozoites found in P. vivax and P. ovale. And these relapses usually occur after a 3 to 6 month period or can be longer. So reinfection obviously can cause recurrences, and reinfection is defined as an infection acquired from a new mosquito bite. A reinfection can be identified by molecular genotyping as well, and this can occur with all species. So in our context, because we haven't yet detected any parasite resistance to date, in our context, most of the reasons for recurrent episodes are due to other reasons. So when we go through a patient who doesn't seem to be responding or has recurrent malaria, we should be thinking about the following. Are we using the appropriate drug at the right dosage, at the correct dosing intervals, and for the correct duration? Quite important is absorption issues. For example, is the patient vomiting? For example, also, are we giving the dose appropriately adjusted for age and for weight? So in terms of weight, for patients weighing more than 85 kgs, the advice is extending the treatment course to 5 days and administering 4 tablets per dose, as compared to if a patient is less than 85 kgs, where you get co-Artem administered over a 3-day period. And for example, the administration, very important co-administration of the co-Artem with food, for example, fatty meals. So adequate absorption of lumefantrine component is critically dependent on co-administration with food or drink containing at least 1.2 grams of fat. So that's about equivalent to 100 mils of full cream milk. So it's really important that this occur to allow for good absorption of the drug. Then compliance, is the patient taking the treatment as prescribed? And less so in our context, but definitely in other parts of the world. Product quality. So is the drug counterfeit, fake, or expired? So all of these are the things that we need to think about before thinking about parasite drug resistance. However, we still need to keep this in the back of the mind, because we do get patients that are infected in other areas, travelers, tourists, etc. And if parasite drug resistance is being considered, then testing can be done at the NICD for these cases. Some of the other questions is, when would you be alerted to possible parasite drug resistance if you've checked for all of the above? So generally, if you are seeing viable parasites on the peripheral blood smear on day 3 of adequate treatment, that's one of the early warning signs that you could possibly be dealing with a parasite that's partially resistant to artemisinin. However, you really do need an expert to look at the smear because you're looking for viable parasites, and you don't want to misidentify dead, degenerate, or dying parasites as viable parasites. So the second biological threat that's parasite-related is this issue of HRP2/3 gene deletions in Plasmodium falciparum. So malaria microscopy is still considered the gold standard for malaria diagnosis, but it's not really point-of-care tests. You need expertise and equipment which is required. Rapid diagnostic tests, which are point-of-care, have transformed malaria control, enabling better targeting of treatment and improved surveillance. And to highlight how widely used they are, you can have a look at this graph and the statistics that nearly 4 billion RDTs for malaria were sold over the past 10 years, the majority distributed in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see here in the orange, to diagnose P. falciparum infection by targeting one of its antigens. And this antigen is called histidine-rich protein 2, or HRP2. Now, HRPs are amongst the most abundant malaria proteins that are produced by the parasite, and they're produced across the asexual life cycle. Rapid tests based on this antigen show high sensitivity because antibodies target repeat motifs in a highly expressed protein. But parasites that cannot express HRP2 may then not be detectable by these RDTs, and those that no longer express both HRP2 and HRP3, a protein, are completely undetectable by such RDTs, so giving false negatives. And obviously, if you are unable to detect infections using this test, this puts patients at risk of misdiagnosis, significant morbidity, and potentially deaths. There are some regions where there's a combination rapid test that's used, which combines HRP2 and a pan-LDH. In these instances, you can get an incorrect diagnosis because you may miss your PF and interpret it as a non-falciparum malaria. So this can potentially impact treatment regimen and the patient outcome. In both the situations, it impacts routine surveillance data because the estimates of malaria incidence will be adversely affected. Now, a lot of the times when I've presented these talks, the question has always been, so how crucial is HRP2 to the parasite? And if you have the deletions, what is the fitness cost? So reading around, in fact, even though it's been studied for a long time, the exact functions of HRP2/3 in the parasite are not fully elucidated. So it's thought to be an important factor in the detoxification of heme. But in these parasites that have the gene deletions, hemozoin is still produced, which means that there's some redundancy in this detoxification of the heme. There are some other articles that say that HRP2 does affect some of the membrane of the parasitized red blood cell, etc., and some in vitro experiments that show that there is fitness cost from these deletions. But what this actually means is not well. What we do know, though, is that these parasites with these deletions can be transmitted and can cause disease. Whether they have reduced pathogenicity is still to be understood. So here again, we have the WHO malaria threat map showing and tracking these deletions across time. And these deletions were actually first reported a decade ago in Peru. And then they were subsequently found in neighboring countries, as you can see here, the dots over the South American countries. And what happened is this reached such a prevalence that it led to a reversion to microscopy as the primary diagnostic tool in this region. Over the past 6 years, there have been an increasing number of African and Asian countries, and in these countries where diagnosis is heavily reliant on the HRP2-based RDTs, that have reported increasing deletions, raising the threat to a new level. And here over the continent, we see these deletions have been detected across parts of East, Central, and West Africa. In fact, in countries like Eritrea, they're reporting a prevalence of greater than 80%, and in India, around 4%. And you can see that there have also been studies done in South Africa where we haven't detected any gene deletions. I've heard from Jayshree that there have been 2 cases in Mozambique where these parasites with these gene deletions have been detected, and 1 case, I think, in someone from Eswatini who was detected, who was a traveler returning to China. But so far, none detected in South Africa. So what this means is that because we are so heavily reliant on these RDTs, these deletions present a major threat to reliable diagnostics. WHO says when the percentage of false negative RDTs results exceeds 5%, alternative tests are needed. But these options are limited. So if you look at this diagram showing the current R&D pipeline, including products to address these gaps, you can see that none of them are really at the level of scale-up. And so there's a lot of research going into improving existing point-of-care platforms, including an ultra-sensitive HRP2 detection test, but also developing alternatives in terms of the sample types and the technologies, including digital microscopy and using AI algorithms to make malaria diagnostics, point-of-care tests based on hemozoin and nucleic acid detection assays, as well as biosensors. But none of them are ready for scale-up just yet. So in most settings, for example, like in our country, deletions in parasites are not likely to be the main cause of false negative results in our RDTs. In our setting, and what we find from the cases referred to the Parasitology lab for smear review and PCR, we find that most of the time the false negatives are due to operator factors. There are other reasons as well. You know, different types of kits have different levels of sensitivity, how the kits are transported or their storage conditions. Also, you know, if it's a very low parasite density below the limit of detection of the test, or a very high parasite density leading to the prozone effect, these can all be reasons for false negatives. But parasite factors due to the gene deletion in our setting is not yet an issue. So in terms of operator factors, just to show you, it's really important. Anyone can be trained to do an RDT, but it's really important to follow the manufacturer's instructions and your SOPs very carefully to get the right result. Here we have some errors seen in practice that have led to false results. So for example, on the left-hand side, if you put too much of blood into the well, you can clog the well and it can result in a false negative because the sample can't flow across the strip. It can also cloud the result window, leading to false positive or false negative results depending on how the person is reading that test. For the blood and the buffer applied to the buffer well, so there's a certain well for the blood and a separate well for the buffer. If you apply the blood and the buffer to the same well, there's reduced efficiency in lysing of the red blood cells and the binding to the free malaria antibodies. And these can result in a false negative result. It can also result in an increased clouding of the background, making the test difficult to interpret. Reading the test before 20 minutes or after 30 minutes, or as indicated per manufacturer's instruction, can actually increase the chances of an incorrect result. And also putting in too much buffer dilutes the blood sample, which can then lead to a false negative, because the buffer rapidly will move across the test strip, decreases the time for the binding, and resulting in a false negative. So it's really important that the test be done correctly to manufacturer's instructions. So just a word then on vector-related emerging threats. So evasion by vectors that are adapted to breeding in urban environments, such as the recent spread of Anopheles stevensii in the WHO African region, are putting urban populations at increased risk. So we talked about the very successful current vector, the Anopheles gambiae on the African continent. But this new invasive species, which was native to South Asia and parts of the Arabian Peninsula, has been expanding into Africa, and it differs in terms of its behavior to Anopheles gambiae. It's particularly concerning because it has a number of characteristics that make it difficult to control. The species thrive in urban areas. They like being near humans. They can lay their eggs in any available water source, such as water containers, abandoned tires, and flower pots. The eggs can survive being dried for a long period of time. It can feed on a vertebrate host both indoors and outdoors. And so this reduces the impact of commonly used vector control methods. And it can also be quite resistant to insecticides. So this invasion of this urban mosquito into Africa actually threatens the malaria elimination aspiration continents, particularly as about 43% of Africa's population now live in urban areas. So this particular species was first detected in Djibouti, where it caused, is thought to have driven the resurgence of malaria in the city and to be the source of at least one outbreak in Ethiopia. So a new initiative has been launched by WHO to try and limit the spread of this vector on the African continent, and to determine whether it can be eliminated from areas where it has already invaded. It's going to be very difficult and expensive, and it's been termed an emerging infectious disease disaster that may still be prevented. And when we were speaking to Prof. Reen earlier, he talked about how in Brazil there was really concerted efforts to get rid of Anopheles gambiae when it reached those shores. And with a lot of help from, I think, America, eventually that vector was eradicated. So similarly, here you see the WHO initiative. There is a document, it's been updated in 2023 to try and stop the spread of this vector on the continent. On the graph on the top, you can see how this vector contributed to an increase in upsurge in numbers in Djibouti in 2020. And the map on the right shows the spread of Anopheles in Africa, but from 2012 to 2022 across these countries listed here. And I've recently just heard from Dr. Rahman, who attended a recent meeting, that Anopheles stevensii has actually been detected in the first SADC country. So it's been detected in Tanzania, in an area close to the border with Kenya, through their surveillance efforts, so not in a relation to an outbreak. But yeah, it's highly worrying that it's now making its way southwards, and the publication on this is pending, soon to be published. So here again is the vector occurrence and the mapping, and you can see in green that this vector is native to Southeast Asia, and has now made the jump, especially into East Africa and the Horn of Africa. How it has come to be on the African continent, there have been various papers looking at whether it made its way to the continent via the port, because in Djibouti city, the outbreak was close to one of the ports. But when they compared it to Aedes, which spreads urban yellow fever, I think some of the thinking is that it's actually not being spread via ports or ships, or because the eggs can't survive as long as Aedes. And they think that when they were tracking the wind patterns, that this vector may actually be carried on the wind. And so there's a lot of work going into understanding how it's spread to try and mitigate the further spread on the continent. So just a quick word on vector insecticide resistance. So mosquito resistance to insecticides is really important. Here you can see the threat map showing pyrethroid insecticide resistance. Pyrethroids is the most common chemical used in insecticide-treated nets, and resistance to this compound is rising globally, with 78 countries confirming resistance to at least one insecticide class, and 29 countries noting resistance to all 4 current classes, so that's pyrethroids, organophosphates, carbamates, and organochlorines. And of concern is this high-intensity pyrethroid resistance, particularly present in Western Africa, where you can see the concentration of the red dots on the map. And to overcome insecticide resistance, WHO is recommending the use of dual active ingredients in insecticide-treated nets. So just a word on then what is happening on the continent and a really dangerous situation that is taking place in the Horn of Africa. So if you look at this graph here, looking at malaria in the Horn of Africa from the 1900s to 2020, tracking the number of deaths and the burden of malaria. And in blue, that's the curve in blue and the bar charts in red, showing the evolution of the estimated number of malaria deaths and the number of deaths per 10,000 inhabitants during the same period. So what you can see that is tracked against this in the black boxes are all of the different initiatives that have been implemented to reduce the burden of malaria across this region. So more recently, insecticide-treated nets, indoor residual spraying, intermittent preventative treatment, seasonal malaria prevention in children, ACT standing for the combination artemisinin drugs, and RDTs, the introduction of the rapid tests. So these have been all the interventions made. But in purple, what you can see is the emergence of malaria-associated biological threats. So for example, more recently, there's been insecticide resistance, there's been Anopheles stevensii invasion, anti-malarial resistance, and then these parasites with the HRP23 deletion. And all of these are now happening in a very short space of time within the last 10 years in this region, the Horn of Africa. And if you add to this the conflict and a humanitarian crisis that's happening in this area, this is painting a really dangerous picture for malaria on the continent. So when a scientist was asked what happens if all of these come together and they coexist, we actually really don't know how this is going to play out, but it's leaving you with a situation where you have a parasite you can't detect. And if you do detect it, you can't really kill it with the drug. And the vector is now wise enough to try and evade your control mechanisms and change its behavior. So what this means for us here in Southern Africa is that we really need to be vigilant and we need to watch this space. So just finally, in threats to malaria control, because we're coming up to 4 o'clock, is a word on zoonotic malaria. So we know humans are the only known reservoirs of the 4 malaria parasite species. That's Falciparum, Vivax, Ovale, and Malaria. P. knowlesi causes zoonotic malaria, and the natural hosts are the long-tailed and pig-tailed macaques, as you can see in the picture at the bottom. So P. knowlesi is actually becoming a significant concern for malaria control, especially in Southeast Asia. It's a zoonotic parasite with a human fatality rate of 1 to 2%, and it's known for very severe and rapid onset. So you can see the map on the top that large infection clusters were discovered in Malaysia in 2004. And since then, in just 20 years, it's spread across nearly all of Southeast Asia, and globally, cases have been detected through travel and tourism. So even though recently global cases have declined, there's been significant increase in Indonesia and Thailand. And in Malaysia and Thailand, P. knowlesi accounted for all malaria deaths in the last year. So the real concern about this is there's increased, the spread of knowlesi complicates malaria elimination efforts, and it affects WHO's certification process for malaria-free status, because the status didn't consider P. knowlesi, only the other 4 human parasite species, which now means WHO is reassessing the certification criteria in light of the rise of the zoonotic malaria. And as you can see on the right-hand side, that the risk zone is where the monkey habitat and the human dwellings merge through to ecotourism or deforestation or agricultural practices. And there's a whole host of interventions now being made in these countries to try and reduce the burden. And I've just been to Malaysia for the recent International Conference on Tropical Medicine and Malaria. And there's been a lot of, obviously, work in the area and a lot of concern and efforts to try and control P. knowlesi. So given all of that, gains have been made despite all of the emerging threats that need to be recognized. According to the last WHO report, 25 countries have eliminated malaria over the last 2 decades. And this does not include Egypt and Cabo Verde, which are the 2 most recent countries. There have been 11.7 million malaria deaths averted for the last 2 decades and 2.1 billion cases avoided. And 49 million children have been treated with malaria seasonal chemoprevention, and more than half of children less than the age of 5 are protected by insecticide-treated nets. But I think the real game changer and good news story is the introduction of the 2 WHO-approved vaccines, the RTS-AS01 and the R21, for children living in malaria endemic areas and to prioritize areas of moderate and high transmission. Both of these are pre-erythrocytic vaccines that prevent P. falciparum infection and subsequent illness and death. Both of them have been shown to reduce malaria cases by more than half during the first year after vaccination. And this is a period when children are at the highest risk for illness and death. Reduction in severe malaria and a 13% drop in early childhood deaths in areas where the RTSs have been administered has been seen when compared to areas where the vaccine has not been introduced. And as of early this year, malaria vaccine has been introduced in 8 countries, and additional countries planning to introduce in coming months. And in fact, most recently, Mozambique, our neighbor, has introduced life-saving R21 malaria into their child immunization campaigns. Child mortality in Mozambique is high, and the prevalence in children under the age of 5 years of age is 32%. And so they have started vaccinating in the 22 districts in the province where they have the highest prevalence. And they have started on the 5th of August this year, administering the 4-dose schedule to cover children aged 6 to 11 months initially. And then there are the further other countries that are earmarked to roll out between 2023 and 2025. And the DRC has actually just started their campaign as well. So good news story for malaria and especially for mortality in children less than 5. So just locally, in terms of chemoprophylaxis, a few updates, and this is almost my last slide. Just to mention that in January 2024, a circular was disseminated by the National Department of Health to provinces and healthcare facilities regarding malaria prophylaxis using oral doxycycline. And this is for travelers to moderate or high-risk areas, for those eligible traveling to endemic areas in South Africa between September and May, and intending to travel to malaria endemic countries outside of South Africa, and obviously to be used in conjunction with other malaria preventative measures. And so what this means is that this was included in the primary healthcare level STGs and EML for non-pregnant adults and for children over then or equal to the age of 8. Obviously, for pregnant patients and children less than 8 years old, doxycycline is contraindicated, and in fact, malaria travel to malaria areas is not advised for pregnant women and children less than 5 years old. But if travel is unavoidable, then you would have to then look for a prophylaxis in the private sector. And I know this has been a problem because pediatric formulations haven't been available. But I've just been told recently by Prof. Bloomberg that this drug is the pediatric atovaquone and proguanil will shortly or soon be available in the country for children that need it should they be traveling to malaria risk areas. And so some of you may know more about this than I do, but I thought I'd just mention it there. So finally, the take-home messages is that there has been progress despite the challenges. But there needs to be an acceleration, as mentioned, because there are new and emerging threats. There are strategies and operational frameworks to try and address these concerns. In terms of South Africa, we seem to be on track to achieve elimination by the year 2028. To remember that malaria is a Category 1 notifiable medical condition, and to be aware of anti-malarial resistance that's emerged on the continent, but that in our setting, recrudescence and treatment failure usually occurs due to other reasons, that there is evasion of detection using the HRP2-based RDTs, and again, in our setting, currently, false negative RDT results are most often due to reasons other than this. But if you do have cases where you're suspecting anti-malarial resistance or parasites with HRP2/3 deletions, to please contact us here at the NICD to discuss and to see if further testing is required. So just to remember, now we are currently moving into our malaria season. We generally get cases peaking after people return from the December holidays in January and February. To have a high index of suspicion for malaria in patients with fever or flu-like illness that occurs up to 3 weeks after potential exposure. To keep in mind Odyssean malaria, although rare and sporadic, but people who have had no recent travel history consider malaria as a differential diagnosis and test for it, especially in patients with unexplained fever who are getting progressively sicker, and especially if they have low platelet counts. To remember that artemether lumefantrine remains very effective in our setting for the treatment of uncomplicated malaria, to make sure that patients take each dose with some fatty food to ensure optimal absorption of the drug. And then to remember that IV artesunate is the recommended treatment for severe malaria, significantly better treatment outcomes compared to IV quinine, easier to use, and is the preferred treatment. And I don't think that quinine is available widely anymore. But these are the take-home messages, and I'd like to thank the CEZPD team involved in various malaria activities at the NICD, with special mention thanks to the Parasitology Reference Lab, Prof. John Freen and Prof. Lucille Bloomberg. And with that, I thank you. Sorry, I went over time. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. It's really, really fantastic as always, and really comprehensive to also scour the horizons for the things that are threatening the malaria control, as you said. And it is a horrible thought, as you said, to these combination of these HRP2 deletions and the artemether resistance, and then the new variants of Anopheles mosquitoes all coming online. So thank you very much, though, for covering it. There's 1 or 2 questions in the chat. I just because we're out of time, I'm just going to maybe save Charlotte, if you're okay, just replying to them in the chat if you have time. Otherwise, I'll take a crack at it if you have to go. But I just wanted to check with you one aspect of it. South Africa obviously wants to eliminate malaria. We're presuming we're just meaning endogenously acquired malaria in South Africa, right? But isn't that pretty hard to accomplish if just across the border is another country which may not be in the same stage of elimination? I mean, how does that threaten the elimination too? I mean, if say in Botswana and the Zimbabwean borders, it's not well controlled.
Yeah, I know. I mean, 100%. It has to be a regional effort. And there is a lot of collaboration going on with the SADC countries, especially the Eliminate 8 countries. Because you're completely correct. We're going to try and eliminate local transmission within the borders, but there's always the risk, obviously, of mosquitoes don't respect borders. And I know there have been trans-border mobile units and a whole lot of other interventions that are at play. But it is a regional, that's exactly why it is a regional effort in order to move towards malaria elimination in the region. And I think it speaks to why SADC Malaria Week is really so important, because we can't just do it on our own. Yeah, and that is the big challenge.
Yeah,